Okay, guys, not quite the talk I was going to give you, but I had this already to go, and honestly, it holds up pretty well. And seeing as though I haven't finished playing Assassin's Creed Valhalla yet, I didn't want to talk about it. These two, on the other hand, I can speak a little bit more freely. All right, so this is actually my conference paper from last fall's International Society for the Study of Medievalism virtual conference. So I'm going to give it to you as I gave it to them, and hopefully you'll find it interesting. So, as many of us know all too well, Scandinavia is a dangerous territory for popular medievalism. On one hand, representations of medieval Scandinavia and the Viking Age are immensely attractive to the modern audience. On the other hand, such representations have a long history of being co opted into the service of white supremacist ideology. I would argue that video games that venture into this territory can be especially prone to this. Firstly, because a game is immersive and, for better or for worse, encourages the player to identify with the character, or in cases where the character is a blank slate, to design them in accordance with what they feel a heroic character in this setting should look like. Secondly, because games that use the medieval North as inspiration tend to freely mix elements of history and fantasy. The northern medievalism of a game like Skyrim feels authentic to its players because they see, hear, and experience things that they think they recognize as medieval and Scandinavian, and yet none of it truly is. This makes it very easy to blur the line between history and fantasy, especially by those who start with a poor understanding of the history and culture that's being reimagined by such games. I'd argue that this makes it critical for game designers to understand what message they're sending with this use of the material. I think they're beginning to realize this. I mean, none of them want to be Bethesda, emulate Skyrim, and have Stormfront's favorite video game. So I'm going to talk today about two relatively recent games inspired by medieval Scandinavian culture. Both of them turn away from the sort of romantic medievalism inherent in what E.R. Truitt calls the fantasy North, which tends to be inhabited by manly, heroic, generally blonde and blue eyed warriors who often fit the traditional Aryan ideal just a little bit too well. In contrast, the vision of the medieval North that these games present is far darker and psychologically much more complex. The player characters are troubled, even anti heroic, the gods are terrifying, and the concept of Ragnarok takes on whole new dimensions. While these games make use of very familiar historical and cultural material from medieval Scandinavia, as well as from later interpretations of the period, they make themselves much harder to misappropriate because they provide nothing to valorize. On the surface, they're very different games. So, God of War from 2018 is the eighth installment in a long running series originally inspired by Greek mythology. Kratos, the anti hero of the franchise, is now much older, much more tired, and a newly single father to his young son Atreus. The game opens shortly after the death of his wife, Faye, whom he met after fleeing his past in Greece and taking refuge in the north. Father and son have a shared mission to fulfill Faye's last wish and scatter her ashes from the summit of the highest peak in all the realms. But things turn out to be a great deal more complicated than they appear, and Kratos and Atreus find themselves caught up in the chain of events leading to Ragnarok. In contrast, Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice from 2017 is a much smaller game, a quest narrative that blends hack and slash, puzzle solving, and horror elements. It tells the story of Senua, a Pictish warrior from Orkney who has lost her lover at the hands of Viking raiders and is traveling to Hell, or so it appears, to bargain with the goddess of death for the return of his soul. But complicating the player's interpretation of the game is the fact that Senua also suffers from psychosis. This raises the question of how much of what she is seeing and experiencing is real, and how much of her journey into the underworld and the trials she faces along the way are solely in her mind, created as a way of dealing with her grief. I should note here that the game studio that produced Hellblade, Ninja Theory, appears to have done their best to approach the subject sensitively. The game's actually won an award for its portrayal of mental illness. Neither game explores Norse mythology from a Scandinavian perspective. Kratos is Greek, and his son Atreus' lineage is complicated. Although his deceased mother was northern, she was secretly one of the Jotun, the race of giants who suffered genocide at the hands of the Aesir. Senua, meanwhile, is a Pict. She's a victim of the Vikings, even if she's from a northern European culture herself. To both player characters, the Northmen, their gods, and their mythology are foreign and hostile. Although both games make extensive use of figures from Norse mythology, very few of these mythological figures are humanized in the way we tend to see in other works, such as the Marvel movies. More often, they're monstrous, unpredictable, and uniformly dangerous to deal with. The most influential god in God of War is the one the player never sees. Though he never appears on screen, Odin's cruelty and his obsession with the prophecy of Ragnarok drive the narrative of the game. Targeted by the Aesir at Odin's orders for reasons they don't understand until the very end of the game, Kratos and his son are helped in their quest by the disembodied head of Mimir, the Norse god of knowledge. Mimir is Odin's former ambassador, who was fused to a tree as punishment for his supposed collaboration with the giants. As they travel, he teaches Kratos and Atreus about the Norse gods, emphasizing Odin's brutality. Amongst the worst of Odin's sins, according to Mimir, is his treatment of Freya, the Vanir goddess who married him to seal the peace treaty between their peoples and prevent further bloodshed. Odin proceeded to steal the secrets of Vanir magic from her and use them against the giants in what he thought was a preemptive strike, hoping to avoid Ragnarok. A devastated Freya tried to leave him, but Odin cursed her and exiled her to Midgard, the curse leaving her unable to do violence, even to defend herself. A Ragnarok-obsessed Odin who practices women's magic that he shouldn't is certainly a portrayal well grounded in the original mythology. Freya is a far more sympathetic character, but her choices also have very negative consequences for herself and others. First introduced as a nameless woods witch who befriends Kratos and Atreus and helps them on their quest, she is soon revealed to be Odin's exiled wife, and more importantly, Baldur's mother. Baldur is the primary antagonist of God of War. His mother believed he was the only good to come out of her marriage, and so when the runes at his birth foretold a needless death, she became obsessively protective of him. Freya chose to use her magic to make him invulnerable, but it had the effect of leaving him unable to feel anything. This shattered Baldur psychologically. His invulnerability makes him a seemingly unstoppable combatant, but he is also deeply unbalanced, prone to self-pity and fits of violent anger. Most of his rage is directed at his mother, and it is his attempt to kill her at the game's climax that results in his death and makes Ragnarok inevitable. Thor, like Odin, operates mostly behind the scenes in God of War, with only a brief cameo at the very end of the game. But Mimir's stories include him as well. The player learns that Thor was an active participant in the slaughter of the giants, and Kratos is told that the magical frost axe he inherited from Faye was made by the dwarven smiths as an act of penance for also having forged Mjolnir, which killed so many of Faye's people. Thor's character is also revealed through his sons, Magni and Modi, who serve as Baldur's henchmen. In Norse mythology, these two are part of the rebirth of the world after Ragnarok, but in the game, they are thugs who delight in casual cruelty because they are brutalized in turn by their father. They serve as a sort of cautionary tale for Kratos, who is trying to escape his own history of toxic masculinity and build a relationship with his son. In the end, there is no way to interpret any of the Norse gods of God of War through the soft focus lens of romantic medievalism. In contrast, Hellblade's use of the Norse gods is more minimal. Unlike God of War, they are not literal characters in Senua's story. Instead, they seem to be manifestations of her mental illness, metaphors for her grief and anger at the death of her lover Dilian and the destruction of her village. Senua only knows the stories of the Northmen because of Druth, an old Irishman who was once enslaved by the Northmen. Senua and Druth first met when she exiled herself to the wilds to try and deal with what she saw as her curse, which is her interpretation of her mental illness. After the raid on her village, his stories of the Norse gods gave her a way to personify her fears. Nowhere is this more clear than in her encounters with Hela, the game's version of the ruler of the underworld. When Senua confronts Hela for the first time, the goddess of death is a vast, monstrous being, half rotted on one side, who attacks the terrified Senua and sends her falling from a bridge. Gila is a genuinely horrific sight, even obscured by storm and darkness. Senua's failure in this first encounter happens because she is still in denial and thus quite literally unable to look death in the eye. When Senua confronts Gila again at the end of the game, she finally comes to terms with her loss and surrenders, telling Gila to kill her but to remember that she has no power over her. Gila runs her through with her own sword, and Senua experiences a vision of Dillion, who tells her that death is a part of life, not something to be feared. Afterwards, the now human-sized figure of Gila is replaced by Senua herself, who steps back into the real world. The implication here is that Senua had been clinging to Dru's stories of the Northmen in order to have a target for her grief, to give herself something to fight. The idea that Gila had the ability to release souls from the underworld, likely inspired by the Norse Hel's willingness to let the dead Balder return to life if all living things wept for him, allowed Senua to find her way through her grieving process. Though figures from Norse mythology play very different functional roles in these two games, they deviate from traditional popular culture representations in strikingly similar ways. They are not romanticized figures and are rarely even admirable. God of War's gods are perhaps more true to their mythic roots in that they are not like us. They are not subject to the ethical boundaries of human society, while the divine monsters of Hellblade exist to reflect what a troubled, grieving outsider might have imagined about the beliefs of the people who destroyed her home. Both games employ a novel form of northern medievalism, one which has been thoroughly separated from the traditional heroic ideal. The way these games deal with the mortal world of the medieval North also shies away from the well-trodden path in a very fundamental way. There are no actual Vikings here. Historiographically speaking, the somewhat sanitized revisionist image of the Vikings as traders, not raiders, has given way to an understanding that we can acknowledge the economic and cultural contributions made by medieval Scandinavians while still understanding that Viking raids would have been traumatic events. When Senua encounters her mind's representation of the Northmen in her quest, they are monstrous creatures, not men. Their faces are hidden by bizarre masks, their bodies marked by wounds that look almost self-inflicted. Some seem to have either branches or feathers growing out of them. It's important to acknowledge that Senua herself never meets any of the raiders. They struck during the time that she had self-exiled herself to the wilderness, and in her flashbacks, she returns to find her village already destroyed. Her concept of them as monstrous and inhuman is based solely on her reaction to witnessing the aftermath of the attack. In one of Hellblade's most haunting scenes, Senua relives her discovery of Dillion's body, which is strung up in what would seem to be a blood eagle. For anyone who isn't familiar with this concept, supposedly it was a form of execution that involved cutting open the back, removing ribs, and then pulling the lungs out to resemble the wings of an eagle, all done while the victim was still alive. Suffice to say, historical evidence for the practice is sketchy at best. There are only 2 saga references, and the idea seems designed to appeal to Christian tastes for martyrdom. But it's definitely an idea that's lived on in popular culture. When I first watched this scene, I thought, really? We're going to do this? But on reflection, I was less bothered. Senua never calls what was done to Dillion a blood eagle, nor does Dru's voice in her head. She simply believes the Northmen sacrificed him, which is why she convinces herself that she needs to rescue his soul. None of this is meant to be the literal truth about Norse religious practices. The game concedes that. It is simply how Senua interprets Dillion's death through the filter of the horror stories that she hears from Druth, while she's stuck in the denial phase of her grieving process. Like Hellblade, God of War has very little role for actual Northmen, although it's for very different reasons. With the world moving towards Ragnarok, the consequences are being felt even by mortals. The dead are rising, and it seems that the living either died, fled, or became monsters themselves. Kratos and Atreus encounter almost no living humans. The sole exception is a group of cannibal reavers encountered early in their journey while they are still trying to make their way towards what they think is the peak where Faye wanted her ashes scattered. The reavers attempt to kill them for food, but when Kratos kills them instead, they quickly transform, rising again as Drogair. Freya later tells them that the Drogair, the so-called Hellwalkers, are, quote, poor, restless souls, denied their judgment and their peace. This plague of dead is but a symptom of a world out of balance. Father and son later discover that hell is overflowing due to the absence of the Valkyries, who would otherwise sort and cull the dead. In a series of side quests that primarily serve as a test of the player's skill at the game's combat system, the player can discover that this was in fact Odin's doing. He imprisoned the Valkyries in physical form, leaving them unable to fulfill their duties. Sorry, I can talk. As part of his revenge against Freya, who is the original queen of the Valkyries. Of course, this has serious consequences for the Aesir. If the Valkyries are not doing their job, they're not taking dead warriors to Valhalla to fight for Odin in the final battle. On the grand scale, the Hellwalkers are a sign that the order of the world is breaking down. It's a clever interpretation of Scandinavian folklore. After all, the interruption of the ritual process of those who die is indeed how you get Drogair. In the end, I would argue that both God of War and Hellblade avoid reinforcing many of the more dangerous stereotypes that can be connected to popular representations of medieval Scandinavian history and culture. The player does not connect with the central characters on an ideological level, but on a very personal level. Kratos is struggling to be a good father to his son. Senua is trying to find peace after terrible trauma. Unlike Skyrim, there is no way for the player to slip into an uncomplicated heroic role and indulge in the usual tropes of Northern medievalism. That said, it should also be conceded that neither of these games is an open-world RPG, where the designers tried to give the player maximum freedom of choice. But I think RPG designers can learn from what these studios did. These games show us that there are ways to interact with Viking and Norse themes that are far more interesting than traditional romantic medievalism, and which can even inspire players to want to know more about the original sources. After God of War was released, for example, there was a small tidal wave of popular articles that not only talked about the original mythology, but about how the game reimagined it. If a game can make a general audience interested in making distinctions like that, I think that's a very positive trend. Okay, and that's it for Vikings and video games. I hope you enjoyed that, guys.